For 8 long months, the old German Shepherd sat beneath the same rusted bus stop beside Highway 101 inches Brookings, Oregon. Rain poured over him. Coastal winds rattled the broken plastic roof above his head. Tourists stopped taking pictures after a while. Locals stopped trying to bring him home. But every single evening, just before the last coastal bus arrived, the old dog would slowly stand, stare toward the road with heartbreaking hope, and wait for someone who never stepped off the bus. Most people called it sad. Former Navy SEAL Caleb Turner called it wrong, because dogs did not wait that long, unless they believed their person was still out there somewhere. One stormy night, the old shepherd finally left the bus stop for the first time in months and disappeared into the dark forest above the cliffs. Caleb followed him into the rain, never imagining the trail ahead would uncover a missing man, a hidden crime along the Oregon coast, and a promise so powerful that not even time, grief, or death could make a loyal dog abandon it. Cold rain drifted through the coastal town of Brookings, Oregon, while fog rolled low over the highway and ocean wind carried the scent of salt, cedar, and wet pavement across the empty streets. Caleb Turner drove through town with the heater humming softly inside his aging Ford pickup, one hand resting loosely against the steering wheel while windshield wipers fought against endless rain. At 41 years old, Caleb had the worn appearance of a man who had spent too much of his life surviving difficult places. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and heavily built from years in the military, though time and exhaustion had carved quieter lines into his face. Dark hair touched with gray-framed pale blue eyes that rarely seemed fully present. A faded scar crossed the edge of his jaw beneath rough stubble, and his movements carried the calm caution of someone trained to notice danger before it appeared. People in Brookings respected him because he asked for little. The former Navy SEAL lived alone in a cedar cabin north of town near the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. He repaired fishing boats when work appeared, avoided crowds whenever possible, and spent most evenings alone with silence heavy enough to feel like another person in the room. War had followed Caleb home years ago, not loudly, quietly. In sleepless nights, in empty conversations, in the way he always sat facing doors inside restaurants without thinking about it. He had come to Oregon hoping distance from the world might quiet certain memories, but loneliness had simply learned how to wear the sound of rain. That evening, Caleb stopped at Martha Green's small grocery cafe near Highway 101 for coffee and canned soup. By the time he stepped back outside, the storm had grown heavier. Rain hammered the pavement hard enough to blur the distant road lights into glowing streaks. He climbed into the truck and pulled slowly onto the highway before noticing movement near the old bus stop beside the road. A German Shepherd sat beneath the cracked shelter roof. At first, Caleb assumed the dog belonged to someone nearby, but something about the image forced him to slow down. The shepherd sat perfectly still despite rain blowing sideways beneath the shelter. His black and brown coat had faded with age, especially around the muzzle where gray fur spread like winter frost. One ear bent slightly at the tip from some old injury. His body looked thinner than it should have, but dignity still remained in the way he sat watching the road, not wandering, waiting. A long-distance bus approached moments later from the southern highway. The old shepherd instantly rose to his feet. Hope flashed through his tired amber eyes with such sudden intensity that Caleb felt it from inside the truck. The dog stepped closer to the curb as the bus slowed beside the station. The doors opened. Nobody stepped out. The bus pulled away again into the storm. Slowly, painfully, the shepherd sat back down beneath the flickering light. Caleb remained motionless behind the steering wheel. Something about the disappointment in the dog's movement struck him deeper than expected. During his years overseas, he had seen soldiers wait for helicopters that never came, families wait beside hospital beds for miracles that never arrived, and grieving men stare toward roads long after hope should have died. Waiting changed living things. Apparently it changed dogs too. Without fully understanding why, Caleb parked beside the shoulder and stepped into the rain. The old shepherd finally looked toward him. Up close, Caleb could see age clouding the dog's eyes slightly, but intelligence still burned there. A weathered leather collar rested around his neck carrying a scratched brass tag. Rusty. "You're gonna freeze out here, old man," Caleb muttered quietly. Rusty blinked once before looking back toward the highway. Another gust of cold wind shoved rain beneath the shelter roof. The dog ignored it completely. Caleb crouched carefully, extending one hand. Rusty sniffed the air cautiously but did not retreat. There was no aggression in him, only exhaustion. And something else Caleb recognized immediately. Loyalty. "You waiting for somebody?" Caleb asked softly. Rusty's ears lifted slightly. Behind Caleb, the bell above Martha Green's cafe jingled as the elderly woman stepped outside beneath an umbrella. Martha was nearly 70, short and round-faced, with silver curls tucked beneath a knitted cap and warm blue eyes that carried decades of kindness. After losing her husband to illness years earlier, she had become something like Brookings' unofficial grandmother. She looked at Rusty sadly before turning toward Caleb. "You met our town's heartbreak," she said gently. Caleb frowned. "How long's he been out here?" 8 months. Caleb looked back at the dog. "Every night?" Martha nodded slowly. "His owner disappeared last winter. Name was Walter Hayes, retired bus driver. Quiet man. Loved that dog-like family." She sighed softly. "Police searched for weeks. Found nothing." "But the dog stayed? He waits for the evening bus. Walter used to ride home." Martha's voice lowered. "Every single night." As if hearing them, Rusty slowly stood once more when distant headlights appeared farther down the highway. Another bus. Again, hope filled his tired body. Again, nobody came home. Caleb watched the old shepherd sit back down beneath the flickering light, and somewhere deep inside his chest, beneath years of numbness and silence, something painful stirred awake again. Heavy clouds swallowed the Oregon coastline the following evening, while cold mist drifted across Brookings Harbor and restless waves crashed against the cliffs beyond town. Caleb returned to the old bus stop carrying a paper bag filled with canned meat, dry dog food, and an old wool blanket he had not used in years. He told himself the gesture meant nothing, just basic decency. But deep down, he already understood the truth. Something about Rusty unsettled him because the old shepherd carried the same loneliness. Caleb saw every morning in his own reflection. The dog was waiting beneath the shelter exactly where Caleb had left him the previous night. Rainwater dripped steadily from the cracked roof, while headlights occasionally swept across the highway. Rusty looked exhausted tonight. His old joints moved stiffly whenever he shifted position, and damp wind flattened gray fur against his narrow frame. Yet the moment Caleb stepped from the truck, the shepherd slowly rose and approached him for the first time. "Well," Caleb muttered softly while kneeling, "guess we're making progress." Rusty sniffed his hand carefully before lowering himself beside the bench again. Caleb opened the food and placed it near him. The old shepherd ate slowly but never fully relaxed. Every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward the road. Always waiting. Martha Green crossed the street beneath an umbrella carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Caleb before sitting beside him under the shelter. "You came back," she said quietly. Caleb shrugged. Couldn't stop thinking about him. "That makes 2 of us." For a while they listened to rain strike the highway. Then Martha began speaking softly about Walter Hayes. According to her, Walter had spent nearly 30 years driving buses along the southern Oregon coast. He was known as the kind of man who remembered every passenger's name, carried extra blankets for elderly riders during winter storms, and always kept dog treats in his pocket for Rusty. After serving briefly during Vietnam as a young man, Walter returned home, quieter than before. He eventually married a schoolteacher named Evelyn, bought a small cabin near the cliffs north of town, and lived an ordinary life that somehow made him deeply loved by everyone around him. Then Evelyn died. After that, Martha said softly, it was mostly just Walter and Rusty. Caleb listened without interrupting. He never missed routines, she continued. Every evening he rode the last bus back into town after helping part-time around the marina. Same schedule for years. She glanced toward Rusty sadly. Then one night he just never got off the bus. Police searched for weeks. Forests, cliffs, harbor. Martha sighed heavily. Nothing. Caleb frowned slightly. No body? No. She hesitated. Eventually people started saying maybe he left voluntarily. But I never believed that. Neither did the dog. As if proving her point, Rusty suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the highway when distant headlights appeared through the rain. Another evening bus approached. Instantly, hope transformed him. The old shepherd rose stiffly to his feet and stepped toward the curb, tail moving once with fragile expectation. Caleb felt something painful tighten in his chest while watching him. The bus slowed beside the station. Doors opened. Nobody stepped outside. The bus pulled away again into darkness. Rusty remained standing several seconds longer this time, before slowly sitting back down. The disappointment in his eyes looked unbearably human. Caleb exhaled quietly. Dogs don't wait 8 months unless they know something. Martha studied him carefully. You think Walter's still alive? Caleb looked toward the dark highway before answering. I think the dog believes he is. Rain intensified around them. Martha eventually returned to the cafe while Caleb remained beneath the shelter beside Rusty. Minutes passed quietly, except for passing cars and distant thunder rolling across the ocean. Then Rusty suddenly stood again, but this time no bus approached. The old shepherd stared toward the northern road leading away from town, ears raised sharply. A low sound rumbled in his throat, not fear exactly, but urgency. Slowly, he stepped away from the shelter. Caleb straightened immediately. What is it? Rusty walked several feet toward the road before stopping and looking back directly at him, waiting. For the first time in months, the old shepherd was leaving the bus stop. Caleb felt old instincts awaken inside him instantly. During military deployments overseas, he had learned to trust small changes, sudden silence, altered routines, animals reacting before humans noticed danger. Right now, every instinct in his body told him one thing clearly. Rusty wasn't wandering. He was leading someone somewhere. Caleb grabbed the flashlight from his truck and followed the old dog into the rain. Rusty moved north along the coastal road before disappearing onto a narrow forest trail overlooking the cliffs. Wind bent the tall pines overhead while darkness swallowed the path ahead. Despite age and stiffness, the shepherd walked with clear purpose, pausing every few yards only to make sure Caleb remained behind him. What are you trying to show me, old man? Caleb muttered quietly. Rusty continued deeper into the forest. The farther they walked, the stronger Caleb's unease became. Years in special operations had sharpened certain instincts difficult to explain. Something about Walter Hayes' disappearance felt wrong. No body. No goodbye. No reason to abandon an old dog he clearly loved. And somehow Rusty had spent 8 months waiting at that bus stop as if he understood something nobody else did. After nearly 30 minutes, the trees finally opened. Ahead, perched dangerously close to the cliffs above the Pacific Ocean, stood an aging cedar cabin half hidden by fog and rain. Rusty stopped at the porch steps, then looked back at Caleb once more. The front door stood slightly open. Cold fog rolled over the cliffs above the Pacific, while waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below, their distant roar echoing through the pine forest like something alive beneath the storm. Caleb stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the cabin hidden near the edge of the cliffs. Even in darkness and rain, the place carried the unmistakable feeling of abandonment. Moss crept along the wooden railings. One side of the roof sagged slightly beneath years of coastal storms. The porch light hung crooked and dead above the doorway, while wind pushed the half-open front door gently back and forth with a slow, creaking sound that raised every instinct Caleb possessed. Rusty remained beside the porch steps, watching him carefully, his tired, amber eyes fixed on the former seal, as if waiting for permission to continue. Caleb moved slowly toward the cabin, flashlight steady in his hand. Years in special operations had taught him to trust silence more than noise. Right now, the silence around the cabin felt wrong, not peaceful, waiting. He climbed the porch steps carefully, boots damp against rotting wood, and pushed the front door open wider. The smell inside hit him immediately: wet cedar, dust, cold air, old coffee, and faint traces of dog fur lingering in the walls. Rusty stepped past him and entered first. The flashlight beam swept slowly across the room. Furniture remained exactly where it should have been. A knitted blanket rested over the couch. Books filled crooked shelves beside a small fireplace. Framed photographs lined the walls, many showing a younger Walter Hayes standing beside old buses during different years of his career. In nearly every photograph, Rusty appeared somewhere nearby, younger too, stronger, always close to Walter's side. Caleb studied the images quietly. Walter looked like the kind of man people trusted easily. Lean and weathered with silver hair and tired but gentle eyes, he carried the calm expression common among men who had survived difficult years without letting bitterness destroy them. Nothing about the cabin suggested someone who planned to disappear voluntarily. Caleb moved farther inside. The kitchen looked almost untouched since the day Walter vanished. A coffee mug still rested near the sink beside unopened mail and a pair of reading glasses. A calendar hung on the wall displaying a month, nearly 8 months old. Several dates had been circled repeatedly in red marker. Marina, late cargo, night deliveries. Caleb frowned slightly. Rusty suddenly walked toward the hallway leading deeper into the cabin. The old shepherd moved slower now, limping occasionally from stiff joints, but urgency still pushed him forward. Caleb followed him into a narrow bedroom, where a neatly made bed faced a rain-covered window overlooking the cliffs. Clothing remained inside the closet. Boots rested beside the bed. A faded photograph of Walter and a woman Caleb assumed was his wife sat on the nightstand. She had warm brown hair and kind eyes. Even through age and fading color, love still radiated between them in the picture. Rusty stopped beside the bed and lowered himself quietly onto the floor for several moments before lifting his head toward Caleb again. There was grief in the dog's eyes so deep it almost hurt to witness. Caleb crouched beside him slowly. "You stayed here alone after he disappeared, didn't you?" Rusty blinked once. Outside, wind rattled branches against the cabin walls. Caleb rose and continued searching carefully. In the small office near the back of the house, he discovered stacks of notebooks, harbor maps, bus schedules, and old receipts scattered across a wooden desk. One drawer stood partially open. Inside rested several handwritten pages covered in Walter's careful handwriting. Caleb lifted them slowly beneath the flashlight beam. At first, the notes appeared harmless. Delivery times, boat names, harbor schedules. Then certain words began repeating often enough to pull his attention sharply into focus. Unmarked cargo, midnight shipments, men arguing near Dock 4, Dean Mercer. Caleb recognized the name immediately. Dean Mercer owned one of the largest shipping operations in Brookings Harbor. Wealthy, respected, polished in front of cameras. The kind of man small towns trusted automatically because he donated money to schools and shook hands at every parade. Caleb kept reading. Several pages later, the tone of Walter's writing changed completely. "Someone followed me home tonight. Rusty wouldn't stop barking toward the road. I think they know I saw them at the harbor." Caleb's expression hardened. Another entry sat beneath it. "If anything happens to me, check the warehouse near the North Cliffs. Dean is involved somehow." Rain hammered harder against the roof overhead. Rusty suddenly stood and walked toward the fireplace in the living room before pawing urgently at the wooden floorboards nearby. Caleb approached immediately. "What'd you find?" The old shepherd scratched harder. Caleb knelt beside the loose boards and carefully pulled a pocket knife from his jacket. Using the blade, he lifted one warped plank enough to expose a narrow hiding space beneath the floor. Inside rested a rusted metal box wrapped carefully in old plastic. Rusty whimpered softly while Caleb pulled it free. The box contained several photographs, harbor records, and a small tape recorder. Caleb's pulse slowed instantly, old military focus taking over. He clicked the recorder on. Static crackled briefly before Walter's voice filled the room. Older, nervous, tired. "If somebody finds this, my name is Walter Hayes. I think I found something bad happening at the marina. Men unloading cargo at night that never appears on official schedules. I tried reporting it once. Next day, somebody followed me home." The recording paused briefly. Caleb glanced toward Rusty. The old dog remained perfectly still, listening to his owner's voice again for the first time in months. "If something happens to me," Walter continued quietly, "please don't let Rusty end up alone." Silence filled the cabin afterward, except for rain and ocean wind. Caleb stared at the recorder in his hands while something heavy settled inside his chest. Walter had known he was in danger. Worse, nobody had listened before it was too late. Then Rusty growled suddenly toward the front windows. Low. Warning. Caleb's head snapped upward instantly. Through gaps in the rain outside, headlights moved briefly between the trees near the road below the cabin before disappearing again into darkness. Someone else knew about this place. And judging by Rusty's reaction, whoever had just been watching the cabin was not there by accident. Gray morning fog drifted heavily across Brookings Harbor, while fishing boats rocked against rain-darkened docks and gulls circled low above the restless Pacific water. Caleb barely slept after leaving Walter Hayes' cabin. Long after returning to his own place near the cliffs, he sat awake beside the wood stove replaying Walter's recorded voice again and again, while Rusty slept near the door wrapped inside the old wool blanket. The shepherd twitched occasionally in his sleep, paws moving faintly, as though still searching through memories even while resting. Caleb understood that feeling too well. Some things followed a person into sleep no matter how far they tried to run from them. By sunrise, he had already made his decision. Walter Hayes had spent months trying to warn somebody before disappearing. Caleb refused to become another person who ignored him. Rain fell steadily when he drove toward the sheriff's office overlooking the harbor. Rusty sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the passing streets with tired eyes. People around town had begun noticing the old shepherd riding beside Caleb now. Several locals stopped and stared as the truck passed. Some smiled sadly. Others simply looked relieved that the dog no longer sat alone beneath the bus stop every evening. Sheriff Elena Brooks opened the office door before Caleb even reached it. At 39 years old, Elena carried herself with calm authority sharpened by years of difficult work in a small coastal town where tragedy usually arrived quietly. She was tall and athletic with olive skin, dark brown hair tied tightly behind her head, and intelligent green eyes that rarely missed details. A thin line near her left eyebrow hinted at some old injury she never discussed. Divorce and years handling overdoses, storms, missing hikers, and lonely deaths had worn away much of her optimism, but not her compassion. Caleb immediately recognized another person surviving mostly through discipline. Elena glanced down at Rusty before looking back toward Caleb. "Martha called me," she said quietly. "Said you found something." Caleb handed her Walter's notebook and tape recorder without speaking. 20 minutes later, they sat alone inside her office, listening carefully while rain tapped against the windows overlooking the marina. Elena's expression darkened steadily the farther they read through Walter's notes. "Dean Mercer," she muttered finally. "I was afraid of that." Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair. "You know him?" "Everybody knows Dean." Elena sighed heavily and rubbed tired eyes. "Owns shipping warehouses, fishing operations, trucking companies, donates money everywhere, smiles for every camera in town." Her voice lowered slightly. "There have been rumors for years about illegal cargo moving through the harbor. Nothing we could ever prove." Caleb studied her carefully. "And Walter stumbled onto it." Elena nodded slowly. "Looks that way." Rusty lifted his head at Walter's name. Even exhausted, the old shepherd remained alert whenever conversation shifted toward his owner. Elena glanced toward him quietly. "That dog waited 8 months for somebody to listen." Caleb looked down at Rusty beside his chair. "Looks like he finally found somebody stubborn enough." By late afternoon, Elena quietly assembled 2 trusted deputies while Caleb returned with Rusty toward the northern cliffs searching for the warehouse Walter mentioned in his recordings. Fog rolled thick across the harbor roads, turning the coastline ghostly beneath cold rain and distant ship horns. Rusty appeared increasingly restless the closer they moved toward the old industrial section near the water. The old shepherd's ears remained raised constantly now, body tense despite age and exhaustion. Caleb trusted that reaction immediately. Dogs noticed fear long before humans did. The abandoned warehouse stood near the edge of the cliffs, overlooking rough water below. Rusted metal walls groaned beneath the wind while broken windows rattled softly overhead. One side of the building faced directly toward the Pacific, where crashing waves struck black rocks far beneath the cliffs. Rusty stopped abruptly outside the main entrance. Then he growled, "Low, warning." Caleb rested one hand gently against the old shepherd's neck. "Easy, old man." The warehouse door stood slightly open. Caleb exchanged a look with Elena before stepping inside carefully. Years in the military instantly sharpened his awareness. The smell hit him first: diesel fuel, salt water, mildew, and something metallic hidden beneath it all. Flashlight beams swept slowly across stacked crates, old fishing nets, and rusting equipment abandoned years earlier. At first glance, the warehouse looked empty. Then Rusty suddenly pulled away from Caleb and hurried deeper inside. "Rusty!" The old shepherd ignored him completely. Despite stiff joints and age, he moved with desperate urgency toward the far wall near several collapsed shelves. Caleb followed immediately. Rusty stopped beside an old wooden chair lying tipped sideways on the floor. Hanging over the chair was a weathered bus company jacket. Walter Hayes' name remained stitched above the pocket. The old dog pressed his nose against the jacket and released the softest sound Caleb had ever heard from an animal. Not barking, not crying exactly. Grief. Pure and exhausted, Caleb crouched beside him slowly. "You found him here, didn't you?" Rusty lowered himself beside the jacket without looking away from it. Elena stepped closer while examining the area carefully. "Caleb." He looked up immediately. She pointed toward the concrete floor behind the shelves. Fresh scrape marks crossed the dust, leading toward a hidden steel hatch partially concealed beneath tarp and crates. Caleb's expression hardened instantly. Together they pulled the debris aside. Beneath the hatch, narrow metal stairs disappeared underground into darkness. Elena reached for her radio immediately. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Brooks. I need state investigators and backup units at the North Cliff warehouse immediately. Her voice remained calm, but Caleb saw tension in her eyes now. Whatever existed below those stairs was bigger than missing cargo. Rusty suddenly stood again beside the hatch entrance. His tail lowered slightly while his ears remained raised toward the darkness below. Caleb rested one hand against his shoulder. Stay behind me. The underground room beneath the warehouse stretched larger than expected. Concrete walls lined hidden storage areas filled with shipping records, crates, fuel containers, and computer equipment. Elena's flashlight swept across stacks of paperwork, while Caleb searched farther inside. Then he stopped suddenly beside a small desk near the back wall. Several photographs lay scattered across its surface. One showed Walter Hayes standing near the marina months earlier. Another showed Rusty waiting outside Walter's cabin. Someone had been watching both of them long before Walter disappeared. Elena opened a nearby file cabinet and froze. Caleb. He crossed toward her immediately. Inside the cabinet rested dozens of falsified cargo manifests connected directly to Dean Mercer's shipping company alongside transaction records, proving years of smuggling operations through Brookings Harbor. Several photographs lay scattered across its surface. One showed Walter Hayes standing near the marina months earlier. Another showed Rusty waiting outside Walter's cabin. Someone had been watching both of them long before Walter disappeared. Elena opened a nearby file cabinet and froze. Caleb. He crossed toward her immediately. Inside the cabinet rested dozens of falsified cargo manifests connected directly to Dean Mercer's shipping company, alongside transaction records proving years of smuggling operations through Brookings Harbor. Soft autumn sunlight finally broke through the Oregon clouds for the first time in days, spilling pale gold across the cliffs above Brookings while the Pacific Ocean rolled quietly beneath the morning sky. The town felt different after Dean Mercer's arrest. News spread quickly along the southern Oregon coast once state investigators uncovered the smuggling operation hidden beneath the harbor warehouse. Several men connected to Mercer disappeared before police reached them, but enough evidence remained to expose years of illegal activity moving through Brookings Harbor under the cover of fishing shipments and nighttime storms. Walter Hayes had stumbled onto something dangerous by accident, and instead of looking away, he tried to do the right thing. In the end, that decision cost him his life. Caleb thought about that often during the days following the investigation. Good people were usually the ones hurt most by evil because they never expected it to exist so close to home. Walter had been an ordinary man with a quiet life, an aging dog, and enough courage to refuse silence when silence would have been safer. Caleb respected that deeply. The former SEAL stood outside the small church near the edge of town, while local residents slowly gathered for Walter's memorial service. Rusty remained beside him, calmer now than Caleb had ever seen him. The old shepherd still moved stiffly from age and exhaustion. But the restless desperation that once filled his eyes at the bus stop had softened into something quieter. Peace, perhaps. Or maybe acceptance. People stopped constantly to kneel beside him before entering the church. Elderly women touched his head gently. Harbor workers scratched behind his ears. Even children lowered their voices around him instinctively, as though everyone in Brookings understood they were standing beside a creature carrying grief too large for words. Inside the church, rain-stained sunlight filtered through narrow windows onto wooden pews filled with townspeople who had known Walter Hayes for decades. Martha Green sat near the front, holding a folded tissue in trembling hands, while Sheriff Elena Brooks quietly spoke with several state investigators near the back wall. Caleb remained uncomfortable in crowds. But somehow this place felt different. Not loud, not forced. Just honest sadness shared by people who regretted failing someone kind. The pastor spoke first about Walter's years driving buses along the coast, about the way he remembered birthdays and helped stranded travelers during storms. Martha spoke next through tears, describing Walter as the sort of man who noticed lonely people because he understood loneliness himself. Then unexpectedly, Elena stood. The sheriff rarely displayed emotion publicly, but today her voice carried visible weight. Walter Hayes tried to protect this town, she said quietly, and we failed to listen when he needed help. But because of him, dangerous people were finally exposed before more innocent lives were harmed. She paused briefly before looking toward Rusty lying beside Caleb's feet. And if not for one loyal old dog who refused to stop waiting, the truth might have stayed buried forever. Silence filled the church afterward. Caleb looked down at Rusty. The old shepherd lifted tired eyes toward him briefly, before resting his head back against the wooden floor. After the service ended, most people slowly returned to their lives while Caleb remained outside beneath the cold autumn sky, watching clouds drift above the ocean. Rusty wandered quietly toward the old bus stop beside Highway 101. Caleb followed without speaking. Wind moved softly through nearby pine trees while distant gulls circled over the cliffs. The shelter looked smaller now somehow, less tragic. Rusty stepped beneath the flickering roof where he had waited every evening for 8 long months and slowly lowered himself onto the pavement one final time. Caleb leaned silently against the nearby post. Neither moved for several minutes. Cars passed occasionally. Ocean wind carried the scent of rain and salt through the quiet afternoon. Then far down the highway, familiar headlights appeared around the coastal curve. The evening bus. Caleb watched Rusty carefully as the old shepherd slowly lifted his head. For one heartbreaking moment, hope returned to the dog's eyes exactly the way it had every night before. The bus approached, slowed, stopped beside the shelter. Doors opened with a soft mechanical hiss. No one stepped outside. Caleb held his breath without realizing it. Rusty remained perfectly still watching the empty doorway. Seconds passed. Then the bus doors closed again and the vehicle disappeared down the coastal highway toward California. The old shepherd continued staring after it long after the taillights vanished. Finally, very slowly, Rusty stood to his feet. Caleb felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. For months, this place had been the center of the dog's entire world. Hope had lived here. Grief, too. Rusty turned away from the road at last and looked directly toward Caleb. There was no desperation left in his eyes now. No searching. Just quiet exhaustion and trust. Caleb crouched slowly beside him. "You ready to go home, old man?" Rusty stepped closer immediately. The former SEAL rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck, while cold wind moved around them. For years, Caleb had believed loneliness was safer than connection. War had taught him attachment eventually led to loss, and loss eventually hollowed people out from the inside. But somehow this old dog had walked through all the locked doors Caleb spent years building around himself, simply by refusing to give up on someone he loved. They returned together to the cabin near the cliffs before sunset. Over the following weeks, life slowly changed in ways Caleb never expected. Rusty followed him everywhere now, down forest trails, onto the porch during storms, beside the fireplace late at night, while rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. The cabin no longer felt silent. Empty spaces filled themselves naturally with small sounds, dog nails against wooden floors, sleepy sighs beside the stove, the steady breathing of another living creature nearby. Caleb began sleeping better too. Not perfectly. Some memories never vanished completely, but when nightmares woke him in darkness, Rusty always lifted his head immediately, as if reminding him he was no longer alone. Elena visited often under the excuse of updating Caleb about the ongoing investigation. Martha occasionally brought homemade soup. Slowly, almost against his will, Caleb found himself becoming part of the town instead of hiding from it. One evening near the beginning of winter, Caleb and Rusty walked together along the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean while golden light spread across the water below. Rusty moved slower now, age finally catching him fully. But peace remained in him. They stopped briefly beside the overlook where ocean waves crashed endlessly against black stone far beneath them. Caleb rested one hand gently against the old shepherd's back while cold wind moved through the trees behind them. "He loved you a lot, didn't he?" Caleb whispered quietly. Rusty looked out toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, another coastal bus traveled south through rain and fading daylight. But for the first time in many months, the old German shepherd did not look toward the road. He simply stood beside Caleb watching the ocean as evening settled softly across the Oregon coast, and together they turned away from the past and walked slowly home. Sometimes God sends miracles quietly, not through grand signs or loud voices, but through loyalty that refuses to die, through broken people finding each other at exactly the right moment, and through an old dog waiting faithfully in the rain long after everyone else stopped believing. Rusty never gave up because love remembers even when the world moves on. And maybe God placed Caleb in that small Oregon town because healing often begins the moment we stop running from pain and start answering someone else's loneliness instead. In everyday life, there are people silently waiting for kindness, understanding, or simply someone willing to notice them. Never underestimate what one act of compassion can change. If this story touched your heart, Share it with someone who still believes in loyalty, faith, and second chances. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories of courage, healing, and hope. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide every lonely soul safely home.